So let me introduce my friend Duane Richardson. Duane's interest in trains and model railroading comes naturally. Both his father, grandfather, and great-grandfather worked for the Frisco Railroad. Duane and his late father, Paul Richardson, have also been longtime modelers. Duane and Paul were the first father-son to both earn their Master Model Railroad designations. Duane has served the hobby as the chair of the Lone Star Region Achievement Program for 11 years and headed up the LSR Convention Contest Room for 6 years. He has been a contest judge for over 20 years. But better yet, Duane is a narrow gauge modeler modeling an HON3. And more recently, we have dragged Duane to the dark side of SN3. Duane has written articles for the HON3 Annual, and just this past September, Duane chaired the contest room at the 43rd National Narrow Gauge Convention held in Denver. So Duane, I'll run this PowerPoint from my machine and you can narrate, okay?
Sounds like a plan. Well, good evening, everybody. I'm happy to be here. We're going to cover a lot of ground pretty quickly here, but this is a subject that Mark had suggested. Typically in the narrow gauge community, being some of the better modelers in the hobby, we don't see a lot of these mistakes. But after chairing the convention and talking with Mark a little bit and kind of came up with a couple of reasons why we might want to go up and cover some of the basics here. So when working with a wooden structure, first thing you need to do obviously is prepare your parts, and it depends on how you like to do your finish work as to what you're going to do and in what order. But we're going to show some examples here where we took some just plain basswood and we've done some treatments to the wood first before we get too far with it. Mark, next slide. So as you can see in here, we've gone through and we've got 3 pictures down the right, one with stain, one with a rattle can of paint, and one with just some acrylic paint. And this is what has happened when you just put water or a finish on one side of the wood, and it will create what is in woodworking terms, it's called compression set. But if you go in and you put it on both sides, notice now how much flatter each of those pictures can be. When you're working with alcohol stains, one of the things, and I bring it up here, is you want to use, if you're making your own stains, the highest content of alcohol that you can get. 91% is what I usually find in my local drugstore or at Walmart. 70% alcohol is the common one, but 70% means it's 30% water. And more water means more warpage. So the higher the alcohol content you can get, the better. Next slide. So there's a picture of the 91%. If you're working with making your own stains, you can thin down everything from your garden variety wood stains that you find at your local home centers to alcohol and India ink, the old model railroad standby. And India ink comes in other colors besides black, guys. It comes in a white, which actually looks really good when you put that over concrete, by the way. Comes in a couple of different shades of reds and browns and things to that effect. However, one thing I would caution against is using leather dyes. Most leather dyes, almost all of them, are not actually black, but a very, very dark blue. However, if you do get USMC black, nothing to do with the Marine Corps, but it's a great way to remember it, that is truly black and will make a really nice dye. Mix up several different levels of it, maybe half a teaspoon in one bottle and make up another that's 3/4 or 2 teaspoons or whatever, work on adding your different mixes, have several different bottles on hand. And then I like to take some individual pieces of basswood, dip into each of the various strengths of stains, and I glue that down to a piece of foam core, and I write either the name of the stain if I've purchased it, like a Hunter Lion or a Vetero or something like that. But if I've made my own mix, then I write down the recipe for it right next to it. And in woodworking terms, again, we call that a storyboard. And you can take that then and look at your project and get an idea of just what shade of gray or red or brown that you really want to get on your building. And it's a huge, huge help. Next slide. Glues and gluing. And you would think glue would be a no-brainer, but man, it's like talking politics, religion, or NASCAR. Some of the best arguments I've ever heard in model railroading meetings get around what glue to use. Don't want to get into a lot of that here, but I will tell you, when I'm building freight equipment, I really do like to use a good quality carpenter's glue. You see Type Bond there in the center. Type Bond 2's got a really nice tack. It's also waterproof, so once that stuff sets up, you don't have to worry about getting it wet with different paints and weathering materials. However, for just about everything else, I really like Aleene's tacky glue. It gives a really nice flexible joint, so if you get something a little out of plumb, you can kind of tweak it back into shape again. And if you're going to use super glues, I really prefer a gel glue. In woodworking, I use the runny glue, the runny super glue for stabilizing punky wood or a knothole or something like that. But hit me backside and independently here, and I'll tell you a good story about how I managed to glue myself to my work surface one afternoon. So I don't like using the runny glue when I'm modeling. It's just, it doesn't stay where I want it to. So next slide. One of the other things we want to talk about besides glue is how to apply it. And there's, everybody's got their own way of doing things. The bottom right picture I've seen a lot of modelers do that, just put a little bit on their finger and put it on the spot. And unfortunately, you have very little control over this, and you tend to get a lot of squeeze out, which sometimes doesn't get cleaned up quite well. You always end up with shiny spots if you come back in and try to stain this later. I've seen several people, like the middle picture, including a rather well-known YouTuber, just whip out the bottle of glue and start squeezing glue on it. And if you've done that for a long time and you're comfortable with it, that's one thing. But if you're relatively new to the hobby and you're kind of getting started with it, that can make a big mess really quick. The left picture is really, really close. I know a lot of guys like to use a pad of sticky notes, put a little glue on it. Once the glue dries and it's built up a little bit, they just peel that off and throw it away. However, Mark, next slide. You end up with a situation like you have in that upper left picture. If you're not real careful, like most of us, I've got a TV that I can watch while I'm modeling. The game gets exciting, the movie is going good, your favorite team's about to come back from win the game or whatever, and inevitably you look down and you've got your hand in your glue. So what I use is I like the picture on the right. I turn a shot glass upside down. Most shot glasses have got a little well in the bottom of them. You can squeeze your glue on that, and then you can use a toothpick or a sewing pin or even an old micro brush. Once the brush is actually dried out, you can clip the end of that off, and it becomes a very fine, flexible glue applicator, and it works out really well. And the nice part is a shot glass is kind of hard to tip over. And when you're done, you can peel the dried glue off of it, and you're ready to go for the next time, or turn the glass over if you're done for the evening. Next. So one of the things we want to kind of talk about in building some of these structures and some of the common things that we see in either achievement program evaluations or in contests. So we built this little structure here, and I laser cut the thing out. And it's a basic false front store. It's not overly complex, but there are some things here that can really trip you up. Next. One of the things when you're looking at a building is look at the walls that have some sort of slope on them. Okay, a peaked wall should always go on the outside of a joint, and you'll see in some pictures here what I mean by that. The straight wall, you'll notice, has the same, it ends at the same point where the slope terminates. And when you have that kind of scenario, that slope or that side wall needs to be glued to the back of the wall with a slope on it. Next slide. When you don't, and it may be a little hard to see under some of the arrows, but when you glue that straight wall to the outside of the slope, you're going to create a bump out there. And what's going to end up happening is you have your roof deck coming down that slope, but it can't stay tight against the building because of that bump out that's been created. And now you've got to put a somewhat unprototypical piece of trim in there to hide it. Seen this mistake made a few times. Even again, the same well-known YouTuber as before does this on almost every one of his builds, and I'm throwing things at my screen when I see it. But there's an easy way around it. Next slide. When you put the wall on the back side of the sloped wall, now you've got a straight edge all the way down that slope, and then the roof deck will stay tight, and you don't have to worry about putting any odd trim in there, and you can go ahead and put your fascia in. Next. So the other thing I really recommend to a lot of new modelers, and it's something that I'm sure most of y'all already do, but build as much as you can while the building is still in the flat. Walls can be distressed. You can add your joints between boards. You can lift up boards, all the basic weathering, the basic painting, all that. Try to do it as much as you can while the building is still in the flat state and hasn't been assembled yet. You can put your bracing in place if you want to, and then come back and paint it. One of the things when you're working with wood is you want, again, paint both sides kind of thing. So a lot of times you will want to put your bracing internally before you start putting paint on, so that you're gluing wood to wood, not wood to glue. So you don't have to worry about your bracing popping off. The other thing too is when you're painting is almost dry brush it on. It's something that the less paint you apply, the easier it is. It's like putting salt into your food when you're cooking. You can always add more, you can't take it back out again. So it's thin layers that'll build up a nice finish. There are some types of paints that when the more paint you start applying, it will actually start to affect the sheen. And not only will a thicker paint then hide some of the details and the distressing that you've gone to all the trouble of putting in, now you're going to get a little bit of a sheen that you don't want either. Next slide. So after getting all your walls painted, I come back in, and notice I didn't prime anything on this. I went straight to my color coat. I went in then next, and I take a sharp number 11, or I've actually gone to scalpels the last few years. I like those a little bit better. And you can come in and start putting in some expansion joints. A lot of what we do is very old buildings, so they had better timber back then. Fewer knots, straighter boards, larger trees. So we don't necessarily have to put them as tight as we do if you're doing modern construction. But still, a few boards joints in there really can make some nice detail, and it will really pop when you come in a little bit later and add your stains and your other weathering. And you can put them in randomly if you want to be anal retentive about it. You can come in and put them on anywhere from 8 to 10 to 12-foot centers. Most buildings have been 8-foot centers for 8-foot walls on 16-inch centers for ages. So you can go that route with it if you really want to. You can do the math, but for the most part, you can come across there randomly and play with it and come up with a really nice effect. Next. In this picture in the upper right, you can see that something that I've done in here is I've gone in and actually scooped out some of the plywood that this was cut out of. And then I came back in, applied a little bit of a really dark black to give it some shadow, and then stuck a little piece of strip wood in there to show where it's actually not only broken out where the joint was, but it's also broken out to a point where it's exposed one of the studs. The other thing that's pretty popular too, as you can see in the bottom two pictures, is to slide a chisel blade underneath it and lift the boards. The one thing I would caution about that is it doesn't take much of a lift for that to be overdone when you start thinking about it in scale. You know, if you move a board a 32nd of an inch, that's several inches. It can be depending on your scale. So that's another thing to keep in mind. It's a nice effect, but it's also a lot of times in a lot of models very overdone. And on the subject of overdone, and this is kind of a personal preference for me, but if you think about it from a contest or an achievement program type of environment, nail holes can be a little bit problematic. And the reason I say this is you're creating a hole so that your weathering stain will grab it and show that detail. But what you're trying to emulate there is where the paint has come off of the nail head, and that nail head is now oxidized, and that has caused this staining. It's not a hole on the prototype, it's just the head of that nail. A lot of guys will take a pounce wheel and a straight edge and they'll run it up the siding. One thing I will tell you, I worked construction for a couple of years when I was in high school. The house I lived in my senior year of high school, my dad and I built from the ground up. And I'm here to tell you, I did not lay a straight edge up that siding and very carefully nail them all in a nice straight line. Nor does it leave a hole behind, which is what a pounce wheel or a pen will do. If you want this effect, a sharp colored pencil is a much better way to apply it. However, if the building has a relatively decent coat of paint, you're not going to see the head of a nail used to put siding up. It's going to be invisible underneath that coat of paint. If the building has a lot of paint wore off, then you will definitely see them. And it's a really nice detail to go in. So in a lot of older structures, especially up in the mountains, where more often than not, they didn't put a whole lot of paint on them, if ever, then the nail holes are a great effect. But again, use a colored pencil and don't poke a hole in your model, because again, when you scale it out, That nail hole now, instead of being the head of a small nail, is about the size of a small dinner plate. So keep that one in mind. Next. Another big one, and this is something I actually do recommend when you're working with a laser kit, is paint a lot of the parts when you can while they're still in the carrier sheet. However, one of the common mistakes that we find, and one of the reasons why we decided to do this particular clinic, even in the Denver contest room, I saw a couple of models that actually had this problem where they'd popped the parts out and gone ahead and glued them to the model and hadn't painted the edges first. And we had a couple of door castings on one model, and a door and a window frame that the mullions actually weren't painted on the inside edges either. And it's one of those that it's easy to miss if you try to get ahead of yourself. And it's a lot more common mistake than you'd actually really think. But really make sure as you pop those parts out, you're getting ready to actually attach them to the model, that you've gone back in and painted around the edges. Next. So again, we're talking bracing. You can brace it with pretty much anything you want. Plain old generic basswood that you can buy at a Hobby Lobby or a Michael's is a nice cheap way to get good bracing. You can also go down to a restaurant supply where they actually supply your local restaurants with pots and pans and glasses and whatever else. And you can buy wooden coffee stirrers there. You can buy a box of them with 1,000 or so for less than $5. And they make great bracing. I like to glue mine actually into a T shape and then glue that into my wall. That way, if the wall's going to move, it's got to fight that brace with grain in 2 different directions. So it's really going to have to make an effort to move on me at that point. Those T's or L's, either one, are also a great way to give you something to attach rafters to or ceilings for rooms, and help brace the wall up, and then still allow you to add some interior detail as well. Another one I wanted to bring up too, when you start putting your bracing in, you'll notice the picture in the lower right where he's got it marked labeled traces. One of the things that we'll do is lay the back wall on a false front, is just got the angled slope on it, where the false front obviously sticks up a little bit higher. Lay the back wall up against the front wall and trace that shape onto the front wall on the back side. That'll give you an idea of where you need to glue your bracing and allow for your roof deck to be. And it'll also give you some marks where you want to come back in and paint later. A lot of your laser cut kits either have some sort of interior core to them. I'm not a big fan of that. I'm not trying to beat up anybody that makes their kits that way. Go for it. But I like to do a lot of interior work with my stuff, and an interior core ends up making my walls about 1 foot thick in HO, which is a little problematic for me. So I look at doing my bracing more with the interior walls themselves, with the roof rafters and things. There are other ways to go about doing your bracing, but some kits require a little more effort than others. Just depends on who's the manufacturer is. Next. Now, as you can see here, we've got the sidewall braced in a couple of 3 places. And one of the things you have to be careful about is where you place your corner braces. If you've got these traces coming down on the front wall, for example, if you don't stop them short, you can suddenly start to try to glue the side wall to the front wall, or the side wall to the back wall. And now you've got the glue on it. You're trying to play beat the clock before it starts setting up. And you find that front roof brace is too low, and now you're having to make changes on the fly. So dry fit everything. I mean, we do it when we're building furniture. I do it when I'm making harps and guitars and whatever else. I always dry fit everything together and make sure it's all going to work. And it also allows you to plan out what we call your clamping strategy. Figure out what kind of clamping you're going to need, whether it's going to be a corner brace or a squeeze clamp or a reversed clothespin or rubber bands or whatever you're going to use. It gives you a chance to plan that out and then figure out your gluing sequence. So this is a nice one to kind of keep in mind. Next. Another one that a lot of kit manufacturers don't take into consideration when they cut the roof decks for these buildings. Typically what we'll do when we're drawing them is you've got one and you just hit the button and replicate it, and now you have both sides. However, when you do that, you've actually created a wee bit of a problem, in that if you build it like the picture on the left, where one side overlaps the other, so you have a good solid roof joint there, now one of your eaves is shorter than the other one. If you put them up where both of them now are equal at the bottom, now you've got a trench down the center of it. And depending on the angle of the roof, you can more often than not just glue a piece of strip wood in there and close that gap back up. Next. Here you can see where we've done that with this particular structure. We glued in a 4x4 and it trimmed that out quite nicely. Next, thank you. This particular slide, I mentioned the corner clamps. These are from Kaufman Graphics. I've been using these now for 13 or 14 years. Absolutely love those things because they do a couple of things for me. You build it laying square on and flat on your modeling surface, and then you put the clamp in there, and it allows you to clamp up one board, apply the glue to the other, and then slide that board in place and then clamp it down. And then once you get your, in this case, you've got 4 walls. So we create what we kind of refer to as the L7 method. You're going to create one L, you're going to create a 7, and then you're going to slide those 2 pieces together to create your finished structure. And you can see on the right there where we've used a couple of Irwin quick clamps and a couple of the corner clamps to actually get these things glued together. Next. Now, one of the things that we did run across in this particular set of pictures here, I actually had something happen with the corner clamp that I've never had happen before, in that the foam on the brass piece actually stuck to the model. Not really sure why. There was no glue there. The paint was plenty dry. It had been setting for a couple of days at that point, but it did stick to the model. And one thing, and the reason I put this in there, any honest craftsman, MMR or whoever, will tell you, it's not that they don't make mistakes anymore. It's just they've made enough of them. They know how to fix them. They know how to recover from them. So in this particular case, I wanted to put this one in here just to show, it doesn't always go perfectly. And I came back in, I scraped this one back as best I could. As you can see in the lower right, there's a couple of spots where you can still see a bit of a stain. However, a sign or a well-placed bit of junk a little later will at least, kind of hide that. And by scraping it back, we're at least able to get it to be flat again. So if we do put something up against it, I don't have something protruding off the wall. Next. Another common problem, and we see this from time to time, a lot of your laser cut kits are made out of plywood. So you have realistic, full-size, one-to-one grain, and they'll cut the thing out, and then instead of painting it, modelers will come back in and put a stain on it. And what ends up happening is, you can see in the picture on the left, you get a lot of really pronounced grain, and now this grain is supposed to be is now showing on what is supposed to be individual boards, but the grain runs from board 1 to board 2 to board 3 and board 4 and so on down the line. And it does take a little bit of effort to come in and straighten this back up again. This is an engine house kit that we're working on for our new club layout. As Mark mentioned earlier, I slum it with the guys and do a little SN3 from time to time. And we ended up taking this one back, and I used some colored pencils, some pan pastels, a little bit of Bragdon stains, and did a little bit of work on it. And as you can see here, a lot of that grain is hidden, and you don't have to hide it on every single board. You can actually leave it on maybe board 1 and then maybe board 5, but as long as you hide the fact that it transitions from one board to the next, then you eliminate that. Your eye doesn't see it, and it tucks away. Next. Now, a lot of kits don't include an extra piece of trim, as you see here, for where you've got some sort of bump out. And that's something that gets commonly missed on a lot of models, especially scratch builds. And it's one of those, if you've never built a house before, you just don't know these things, or if you've not really paid a lot of attention to it. And this particular kit, I was really pleasantly surprised that it actually included a piece of trim to put in there. However, as you can see by the raw strip wood there, they didn't give you enough trim to put all the way around the edges of the building. Another one too, if you're building something from scratch, or if you find that your kit's done this, typically when you're building a structure and you're putting the corner trim in place, one board will not be as wide as the other. You'll put the narrow board on one side of the joint, and then the wider board will actually cover the joint and that extra board. And what that width of that second board will then make it look like it's the same width as the other one. And it's really hard to see it in HO, but as you get up into bigger scales, I've found it a little more prevalent when you're building an O, that you can tell that both the boards were a 1x4 or a 1x6, when it really needed to be like a 1x3 and a 1x4 kind of situation. Next. So the next one I wanted to talk about is blackout paper. If you don't want to do an interior into your structure, It's been common for decades to put a piece of black construction paper inside a building. I found a product called Cinefoil that was on a gentleman that does ON30 over in Arizona, mentioned it on his YouTube channel. And I bought a box of it off of Amazon. It's used in the film industry for doing exactly what we do with model railroading. It's a really heavy duty aluminum foil, but the stuff is black and it really blacks out windows really well. It also makes great valleys and for your roofing, for flashing. It also makes really nice flashing around chimneys and things like that too. And it's got a bit of a tooth to it, so it'll take weathering materials and stuff really, really well. But the reason I wanted to bring this one up is run your blackout paper diagonally across the room. A lot of guys will put it in a kind of a horseshoe shape and let the tension hold it in place. But inevitably that ends up putting the paper right up against the window glass. And then instead of looking into the building and seeing darkness because there's no light on, you look into the window and you see paper up against the back of it. And this will kind of eliminate that. You'll be able to allow to see the depth into the building, but just nothing in there. The other thing too, if your kit doesn't have it already engraved in it, or you're working from scratch, do yourself a favor and draw yourself a set of lines like in the bottom right picture going up the deck of the roof. This will help you keep your roofing material straight as you're working up the piece. Inevitably, you will end up, if you don't, finding that you're part the way up and realize you're a quarter inch higher on one side than the other. So this will help keep your lines straight. Another good one too, and I didn't include this in the picture because I wanted you to be able to see the lines. Take that and color it with a Sharpie or a Mark-a-Lot, some sort of black marker. And this can kind of represent the tar paper that would go underneath the roof. So if you have a bit of a gap in your roofing, you'll see the black and not see the naked subdeck there, or the deck of the roof. Next. The name of the foil is Cinefoil. There's another comment in the structure where you can get it. Now note the flashing around the chimney on this one. This one's a common one that gets missed. Smoke jacks will also have it. Plumbing vents is another one. We spend the majority of our time, unless you've got a double deck and you're looking at your second deck at eye level, but we spend the majority of our time looking at our layouts at a downward angle. So our roofs need more detail than any other part of the structure. And one of the best ones is a plumbing vent. If you go outside when it gets daylight and look up on your roof, there'll be a pipe that sticks up a foot and a half, and it just goes up and stops. That is a vent for your plumbing. Without it, water doesn't drain. So you'll see this building does not have one. Therefore, there is no running water in that structure. It's been added since I took this picture, mind you, but it'll also have a little bit of flashing around it. Chimneys will have flashing. This will also divert rainwater around it as it's coming down. So as it hits that smoke jack or a plumbing vent or whatever, it will actually hit that and then run out around it and create a couple of lines down your roofing material. So that's another nice little weathering tip to stick in there. Next. Alrighty, so one of the last common mistakes that we really see, and again, I saw this in one or two models in the contest room in Denver, when you're weathering a structure, the eave protects the upper part of the wall. So it doesn't get the sun on it, it doesn't get the rain on it, it doesn't get the snow on it that the bottom of the wall will get. So your weathering will always be worse or be harder at the bottom, and it'll be lighter as you go up because the bottom of the wall is going to stay wetter longer, so it's going to rot first. So as you can see in this, I did kind of some exaggerated weathering to kind of point that one out. And you can see it in the sloped wall or the one on the right, the most of the two. But as you move up, that paint should look almost brand new for about the top foot to a foot and a half. And there's some structures. I've got a couple of pictures of a barn up by my parents' place in Missouri, where if you looked up underneath the eave of the roof, it looked like it was painted yesterday. But from that point down, it hasn't seen a coat of paint in decades. So one to keep in mind. Next. And putting all this together, you can come up with structures that look something along these lines. That's all I've got. Any questions?
Thanks, Duane. Robin, could you pull up the chat and see if there's any questions for Duane?
Will do. And thank you, Duane. I think you were looking at the chat as we went and answered some questions. So I appreciate that. Jim Curran says, Aleene's has a clear tacky glue that shows virtually no bleed through and dries completely clear. It's not quite as strong as the gold bottle. I didn't know that.
It does.
Yeah.
It does. And my problem with that is I use a clear shot glass, and you put clear glue on a clear shot glass, and all of a sudden it is camouflaged. And it's kind of hard to find where your glue is. So I've tried it, and yeah, I do agree. It does not have the holding strength, and to me, it didn't have the tack of the gold bottle.
Oh, okay.
The other one too, they've got a few of the gold bottles now that actually stand up. If you can get one of those, it's great because the spouts at the bottom, so you're not constantly shaking the glue down to the bottom of the glass. I have an old antique salt cellar that the lid got broken on, and my wife was going to throw it away, and I was like, no, 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 no. And I set that on my desk, and I stand my glue bottle up in it so it keeps the glue down in the bottom where I need it.
That's a good idea. A bit like, ketchup bottles are kind of upside down these days. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. Keith Stamper says, I use a grocery store fruit cup containers for glue. Like I prefer to use a shot glass rack because they have alternate uses. Anyway, Keith eats more fruit than whiskey, so it says they're round, fairly low, and have a recessed bottom.
Yep.
Perfect for liquids, and they will not fall over. So
yep.
Per point. Yep. And Jim Curran again says, for staining individual boards, he uses furniture touch-up markers, which I've seen in the store.
Yes.
Varithene is one brand at Home Depot, and stain the boards. They dry virtually instantly and have almost no warping.
Yeah. Yeah, those are really nice. I've used those not only in furniture making, but I've used them in the modeling as well. And they've got a package you can buy that has like 8 or 10 different colors in it, something like that. So you can buy them individually, but you can buy them as a set as well.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I'll look for those. Greg Wright, one of our local guys, says, thanks for the great comment about fixing mistakes. Yeah, because we all make mistakes, right? So being able to cover a problem is a hard to teach, but a really valuable skill.
It really is. And unfortunately, it's one of those, you learn the lesson the hard way. And it just takes some playing around with it.
Yep. John Scher says, a great clinic, terrific tips that even a good modelist may miss. And you mentioned on there, Duane, that the cinefoil is made by Roscoe, a common supplier of film and theatrical materials. Yeah.
Like I say, I ordered mine on Amazon. If you got Prime, you can have it in a couple of days. It really is some neat stuff, and it's a good size box. So, I mean, it's probably one of those one will last you the rest of your life kind of deals.
Yep. And I think Jake says cinefoil or black wrap. I've not heard of black wrap, but which is also used in film and photography.
That's also from Roscoe. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
one other tip I'll pass along that wasn't in the clinic. I've had a window material called Duralar, Durlar. I have been buying it at Hobby Lobby. It's back on the aisle with the architecture stuff, compasses and angles and all that. However, I had a friend of mine went through in Mississippi and they didn't carry it over there. So I don't know if in their recent reset, they've stopped carrying it, but it is also available on Amazon. And the reason I bring this up, it comes in a couple of thicknesses. I like getting the 5 thou. It is crystal clear. I mean, I've stopped cutting microscope slip covers for glass windows now. Haven't cut one in years because of this stuff. It cuts with a number 11. It cuts with a scalpel. You can cut it with scissors. And more importantly for me, I can cut it with my laser and it doesn't melt. It doesn't, burn or anything quite like that. It cuts really, really nice. The reflectivity, like I say, is just as good as glass. It beats clear, acetates and clear styrene, beats them hands down. You can get it in a roll. I was buying it in a roll over at Hobby Lobby, and it's another one of those. If you want to buy the roll, go together with 4 or 5 of the guys in the club and pick up a roll because you're not going to use it all. Just saw the thing in the chat come up. Duralar, Durlar. You can buy it in 8.5 by 11 sheets, but you can buy it by a roll as well.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, no, I've had a lot of success finding interesting stuff in the kind of more upmarket art supply stores that sell a lot of architectural stuff. If you dig around in there, there's both really cool tools, maybe for pottery, and good quality ones. And in the architectural drawing area, there's some really interesting stuff. It's really good to poke around in there. If you don't have a hobby shop nearby, those are pretty good places for a lot of materials.
Pottery supplies are wonderful sources for hydrocal and molding dental plaster as well. You can buy a 100-pound bag of it for what one of the small little cartons of hydrocal at your train store will cost you. And if you're going to do it that way, go to your local home center or Sherwin-Williams or something like that and buy you 3 or 4 5-gallon buckets with the paint sealable lid. And then divvy it up amongst the buckets. Not that it won't hold it all. It's just, if you're like me, you don't want to be picking up, 50, 60 pounds in a bucket. So I divide it out into 3 or 4 buckets. And with that sealable lid, It will literally last for ages. I just had one I dug out the other day to loan to a friend of mine who was short working on some scenery. That stuff had to be 7 or 8 years old. And he said, yep, worked like a champ. So
Keep the moisture up.
Yeah.
The last question on the list, Duane, was from Don Nelson. Which laser cutter are you using?
I have a Universal. We've had it for 13 or 14 years. It's one of the same models that Art uses out at Bar Mills. It is a workhorse. I love that machine. It's air cooled, so I don't have to worry about a pump going out. I don't get the problem you have with the cheap Chinese lasers where it doesn't make a sharp turn, where it actually makes a bit of a curve, or it runs down and then it burns really, really hot at the corner because it stops and then it starts going. I get really clean cuts with the thing. It's only a 30 watts, so it's not overly fast, but it does work really, really well. It's been worth every nickel.
Cool.